This is one of those moments when you can feel history moving around us.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership that we're working on, this deal would be a good thing, so let's just do it.
The TPP would be the death blow for American manufacturing.
It was to be the largest trade deal in history. 12 countries looking for an economic boost by knocking down tariffs and standing up to China. It was also a signature part of President Obama's agenda, and so not surprisingly, President Trump was having none of it. But now the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, could again have legs. I'll tell you why, and discuss it with a man who says going back to the negotiating table makes a whole lot of sense. Senator Chris Coons is here. And of course, it's puppet regime.
As the 2020 election approaches, we're releasing our biggest update yet.
But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on.
When you're $500 billion down, you can't lose. You already lost. That's not free trade. That's stupid trade. We are going to make trade fair and reciprocal. And I really like President Xi. But we got to get some balance. There's got to be some fairness. And I think at some point we are going to end up doing something which is great for China and great for the United States.
When it comes to trade, most of the news lately has focused on the US and China, and for good reason. When the world's #1 economy slaps hundreds of billions in tariffs on the world's #2, the aftershocks are big. But there's another critical story to watch. Call it the trade path not taken. At least, not yet. Remember TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership? That's that really big trade deal that covered 40% of the global economy. President Barack Obama wanted the United States on board. And Republicans, well, they actually were in Obama's corner. But many of President Obama's fellow Democrats thought otherwise. So what happened? Well, a Republican was elected president. So that means free trade goes on, right? Not exactly. Remember, this is Donald Trump I'm talking about.
TPP was a very bad deal for the United States. It would have cost us tremendous amounts of jobs, would have been bad.
Those against the deal predicted declines in U.S. manufacturing, environmental damage abroad, lower wages, greater income inequality. Those for it saw more U.S. trade and investment, lower consumer prices, and broader economic growth. But the conversation's sort of moot now, right? On just his third day in office, President Trump ended it with the stroke of a pen, ordering a U.S. withdrawal. Thing is, that's actually not the end of the story. Almost exactly 1 year later, President Trump hinted with CNBC he was still thinking about it.
I'm only saying this. I would do TPP if we were able to make a substantially better deal. The deal was terrible.
Turns out the Trans-Pacific Partnership is still out there. In fact, later this month, under a new name, it will finally become a reality. On December 30th, the deal now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, there's no acronym, that's way too hard to say, will come into force. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe worked hard to keep the deal together without the United States, and he's about to reap the rewards. Japan, Mexico, Singapore, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia have all ratified it. Chile, Malaysia, Brunei, Peru, and Vietnam are next. Now, without the United States, it is a much smaller deal, but it's still one of the biggest trade agreements ever concluded, covering 14% of global GDP, some 500 million people. The real importance of this deal, and the reason the U.S. might still join one day, has to do with the country that's been left out. I'll give you a hint. It rhymes with China. At the end of the day, trade deals are an effective way to squeeze Beijing. They're also a way of making sure that if the U.S. ever found itself in a trade war, Washington would have lots of allies on both sides of the Pacific. Without an agreement, it's a lot easier for China to set the terms in Asia. Now, President Trump is right in that the United States will get better direct trade terms when it makes deals with countries one-on-one, where the U.S. is a lot bigger, instead of joining these big multi-country agreements. That's why he's been trying to get a new deal done with Japan, another with Britain. By the way, that one won't happen. But supporters of the agreement have always said that this deal is about so much more than just trade. It's about leadership in Asia, the most economically promising and one of the most geopolitically challenging in the world. And guess who else is taking a second look? That's right, the Chinese. Their leaders see the same picture the Americans do, and they don't want to get shut out. For now, reforms China would have to accept to join are totally unrealistic. The country would have to become much more of a true market economy. There'd have to be big changes to China's gigantic state-owned companies. For the Chinese, it's not really worth it, at least not now. But if more countries join, think South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, Colombia, and if the agreement starts to deliver big returns and big opportunities, Beijing won't want to miss out. Its leaders will start looking to compromise to join the club. That's why Trump, or any future US president, Republican or Democrat, might well reverse course. China's economy is slowing, but it's slowing only for China's frenetic pace. The Chinese are still an engine of growth, the most important in the world, and they're showing more signs of throwing their weight around. Where'd those islands in the South China Sea come from anyway? America had better pay attention. And it's long been said that influence begins with trade. In our coming interview, you'll hear a lot about One Belt, One Road. That's a strategy the Chinese have adopted in building infrastructure and investments in some 60 countries across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It's an estimated $5 trillion initiative that could transform trade as we know it. And it's something the U.S. and its allies should be concerned about.
There's a small but real chance it unzips and turns into Votorama on foreign policy.
Yeah, can't dunk on other central bank governors, right?
Look, he said he'd be unconventional, and he's proven it.
My guest today knows a thing or two about trade and foreign relations, a Delaware Democrat who filled Joe Biden's old seat. That sounds so wrong. He's traveled throughout Asia and the South Pacific, meeting with America's old allies and assuring them that Washington hasn't lost its way. He's also been a leading voice on the Russia investigation. Now here's my conversation with Senator Chris Coons.
Senator Chris Coons from Delaware. Great to be with you, Chris.
Thanks, Ian. Great to be on with you.
So let me start with global trade. And, you know, we have this environment where the U.S. and China are trading spars. You've been pretty concerned about what the Chinese are doing internationally. How on track do you think Trump is with his criticisms right now?
He may be on target, but he's certainly not on track. So I've publicly commended President Trump for making a very high priority of his foreign policy, challenging China's mercantilist policies, the ways in which they compel technology transfer or simply steal intellectual property or limit access to the Chinese market. But the ways in which President Trump has chosen to challenge the Chinese with a tariff war started off badly and have gotten worse. By slapping national security justified tariffs on close allies like Canada or Sweden or South Africa or Germany, just to pick four countries who've complained
Canada
about it.
a national security threat? Is that
Canada
what you're
is
telling me?
not a national security threat, and they don't think they're a national security threat. In fact, they oddly think they've been our closest, most reliable ally right behind the Brits in virtually every conflict we've ever been a part of. So I think when walking into a conflict, you don't start by smacking your best friends and then head in. That was a big misstep, and I think President Trump would be well advised to take a step back and say, we're going to focus on China and their practices, and we're not going to focus on harming our European allies, our Asian allies, our Western Hemisphere allies.
U.S. and Europe, at least for the time being, the guns seem to be holstered.
Briefly, yeah.
The Americans and the Japanese are now actively talking about new trade arrangements. Do you think, I mean, admittedly, the first thing Trump did was get out of TPP and then started hitting allies. But if you look at this just right now, would you say that the U.S. is in a better position to start now working on the China issue, or not really?
Yes, I'll say those recent developments have actually pulled us out of what I thought was a very bad place.
So you feel more comfortable?
I feel less uncomfortable.
Okay. What do you think
I do think there is an opening here now.
What should we be doing with China now? How should we be effectively pressing them, given the challenges that you are very seriously concerned about?
First, one of the things I worked closely with my Republican colleagues here and the administration on was getting the BUILD Act passed and signed into law. This gives us a new tool in our toolkit, a development finance institution that's double the size of OPIC and capable of doing broader and bigger things than OPIC has been able to do in the last 40 years.
So some response to One Belt, One Road from China.
Some response to One Belt, One Road, some response that, if effectively deployed over the next year, allows us to show up in a dozen 24 countries and say, we're here, we're engaged, we're going to channel, we're going to facilitate U.S. private capital into much larger projects than we've been engaging in before. That's an important pushback. Second, we need to be having real
play some
conversations.
offense, basically.
Play some offense.
Okay.
We also need to look at TPP. I think at least 6 of the potential TPP partners have now ratified the successor agreement. It's going to come into force. And
without the U.S.
Without us. We need to look at what it means for there to be a table that we helped build and shape with an empty chair at the end. And whether there is some scenario under which it's in our interest, in our workers' interest, in our economy's interest, but also helps reunite our allies around the Pacific Rim by re-engaging with a new TPP.
Wise, in terms of the Chinese are obviously doing a lot more. They're now talking about a 3rd aircraft carrier as well.
Yes.
I'm more talking about the Horn because I know it's something, you're raising an alarm that's saying, hey, the Chinese militarily are suddenly flexing.
Yes.
How do you think the Americans should respond? How are we responding?
We should respond by investing in alliances and partnerships and by strengthening and modernizing weapons platforms and systems to deal with the security situation we're likely to be in. The South China Sea, the growing Chinese Blue Water Navy are areas where we are likely to face significant threats that without modernization, both of our Navy and of a number of our other operational capabilities, we're not really adequately prepared for. We need to present an alternative to an approach, One Belt, One Road, through which the Chinese are gaining access to or control over or almost literally ownership of key strategic deep water ports, from Djibouti to Sri Lanka, really all across the Indo Pacific.
So far, what I've heard is a lot of talk about carrots, a lot of talk about U.S. strategy, to the extent that there needs to be stick in the American, arsenal with the Chinese. What do you think the largest and most effective stick should be?
If we have an alternative, values-based, international order, where trade and access to trade requires openness, that's the best alternative, I think. So there are challenges in the WTO that we could be more aggressive at bringing. There are challenges based on values that are important. If we continue to engage in relationships such as has been the case with the Saudis, the Khashoggi incident was a pretty critical turning point for us. If we only look at our relationships internationally in terms of transactions and not in terms of values and transactions, then we look more and more like the Chinese in terms of how we interact with the developing world, how we interact with our close allies. I think it's important that we have a values proposition that's different than the Chinese. The Chinese come to heads of state and say, we're not going to ask difficult questions, non-interference in your domestic affairs. We're not going to press you about free press, about human rights, about politically open systems. There's a lot of things that are difficult that we're just not going to raise. And they point to us and say, those guys, however, will interfere in your internal affairs. We have a different view, which is that what we stand for has been codified in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and actually is the best path forward towards all countries to be free and fair and open. And that has attracted allies to support the United States over 70 years.
We have a different view, or we had a different view?
We have to continue to press the view that has been the dominant view of American foreign policy for 7 decades. We're not perfect. We obviously have made missteps and errors at times, but we have to continue to put our values before our narrow economic or security interests. I think that is, frankly, the most powerful way we compete with an alternative vision that is essentially state authoritarian capitalism.
Another place that priorities and values come into play is Ukraine. Trump administration, under Trump administration, we actually have defensive weapon systems that have been provided to the Ukrainians. That was not true under the Obama administration. Does that mean that these guys are more focused on values now with the Ukraine, or no?
I think the guiding principle of President Trump's early foreign policy was whatever Obama did, do the opposite. I would like to believe that there is now a stronger bipartisan consensus around we support Ukraine. We want them to be successful in resisting Russian aggression. We want to see the Minsk process resume and work. But in a region at a time when Putin continues hostile and aggressive actions, we, I think, in the United States have a clear role, which is to marshal our allies in imposing and sustaining sanctions against Russia until they stop aggressive action against Ukraine and implement the Minsk Accords. Providing weapon systems to Ukraine that allow them to successfully defend their territory, I think, is a key part of that.
Now, the Americans have taken individual sanctions efforts against the Saudis in response to the Khashoggi case. In the case of Russia so far, most of what's been done, also a series of individuals. Are you suggesting that what we need are sectoral sanctions against the Russians?
Quite
Something
possibly.
that would really damage the economy?
Yes.
Yes. And do you think the Europeans would be with us in that regard?
Hopefully.
How much, I mean, the transatlantic relationship right now, how much of that is on the United States not being a leader, and how much of that is on the Europeans not having their act together?
The thing that I try to encourage folks to do is to look at actions and then look at statements. If you look at actions, more and more of our NATO allies are getting to the 2% GDP expenditure in defense. More and more of our NATO allies are actually making changes in terms of interoperability, exercises, information sharing, intelligence integration. We are making significant moves in what I think is a good direction. Partly, the clear and present threat from Russia has reanimated NATO. The challenge of migration has been a real challenge operationally and from a values perspective to NATO. But we've also seen changes in the politics of Central and Eastern Europe that are putting NATO and the North Atlantic relationship at some risk. I do think that continuing to not just invest in this relationship, not just exercise this relationship, but to speak in ways that value this relationship are critical to our path forward. The president's wrong about the basic construct of collective security. It's not that we're the chumps and the EU and NATO were created to benefit the EU and benefit NATO to our disadvantage. We helped establish those organizations, those structures for our security and for our prosperity, and we have benefited from them mightily. We can and should continue to have a conversation about burden sharing, but to continue to harangue our allies as if somehow they've taken advantage of us and they all owe us an unpaid bar tab misses the fact that more than 1,000 NATO soldiers have died in Afghanistan fighting alongside Americans, the only time Article 5 has been invoked. I think starting the conversation with gratitude and continued commitment to collective security, and then sharpening the focus on investment is the better way to proceed.
So coming back to the transactionalism, not the right way to approach key alliances. Right. Do you think that the vote to protect the special counsel is now as important, given how much is out, how far Mueller has gone, without delivering an official report? I mean, have we passed the point of no return on the Manafort, on the Roger Stone, on WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, all of this? What do you think?
Every time there's been another charging document or indictment from Mueller, you realize that he had many times more details, information, leads than any leak or revelation about that particular area of his investigation had previously suggested. My hunch is that when this investigation comes to an end, and there is hopefully some public accounting of everything that's been investigated, it'll prove to be far broader and deeper than current evidence would suggest. So I actually think it's important, vital even, that Mueller be allowed to complete his investigation and that work product then be shared with the Senate and the House and be public. Neither of those are a foregone conclusion at the moment. We no longer have a Senate-confirmed Attorney General who's recused himself and a Deputy Attorney General, Senate-confirmed supervising. We have an acting Attorney General, a partisan who a year ago was saying all sorts of negative things about Mueller. We have a president who continues to criticize and attack and tweet against Mueller. I think it is in everyone's interest, including the president, for Mueller to complete his investigation. And then,
why is it in the president's interest for that to occur?
As I've said many times on television, Mr. President, if you're innocent, act like it and have confidence that this investigation will clear you.
But that is a big presumption, is it not?
That is a big presumption.
Especially when, I mean, we know that when we have cases that are this expansive, the ability to get someone on an obstruction, to get someone on a lie after the fact when they've been backed into a corner and Trump trips over his tongue continually, that doesn't sound like it's in his interest to allow the process to continue.
If he injects himself and fires Mueller, having spent months challenging, questioning, harassing, I think that will precipitate a crisis. And I think that will lead to a real challenge to his presidency. I think it is in his best interest to have the whole process play out and then confront whatever it uncovers, rather than to try and cut it short.
You understand how he might think differently.
Of course.
Is it in his interest to not pardon Paul Manafort?
It depends from what perspective. I don't know if he's a president who cares about the judgment of history. If he is, he shouldn't.
Where do you think this actually goes? Does this become a constitutional crisis, and what does that mean in your mind?
What that means is a breakdown in the rule of law and in the ordered relationships between branches so severe that it compels a realignment between branches. Either, as happened in the Nixon tapes case, an appeal to the Supreme Court to reach a decision they hadn't previously considered and to direct an action by the president in order to bring the executive branch back into compliance with basic orders of the rule of law, or some basic challenge to the president's actions as being extra-constitutional.
Would you be relieved by that? In other words, would it be better in your view to say, let's just get this to where there is a crisis, the Supreme Court has to judge, too damn partisan in Congress, and they're going to be an independent arm of government?
Look, I think the Supreme Court had a lasting and negative impact on its important and powerful reputation for being not a partisan political entity, but the ultimate arbiter of the meaning of our Constitution, and thus above narrow temporal partisan concerns. When the Supreme Court ruled on Bush v. Gore by a 5-4 majority and stopped a recount and handed a presidential election to ultimately President Bush, I think they put at risk the credibility of the court as a nonpartisan institution. I worry that with a new conservative majority, and in particular, given Justice Kavanaugh's articulated views on executive power, that they may well take action that would be comparably harmful to the long-held perception of the court as being interested in the primacy of the Constitution and the constitutional order rather than partisan concern.
So in your view, the fabric of the political institutions of this country have been damaged?
They're at real risk. They're at real risk. If the president allows Mueller to complete his investigation, if the investigation produces results which the Congress then handles responsibly, if the Supreme Court doesn't shut down or prevent Mueller from recommending what actions or reporting what actions he might, I think that goes a long way towards sustaining our current constitutional order.
So last question, Senator. Yeah. How does it feel to be in your position at such an important point in history?
Well, you know, all of us are here by some combination of luck, chance, error, providence. It's challenging. I struggle every day with whether or not I'm doing enough, whether I'm doing a good job, whether I'm representing my constituents well, whether I'm doing everything I possibly can to be fair, to be engaged, to be honest, to be disciplined, and to be a contributor. But this is one of those moments when you can feel history moving around us.
Chris Coons, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian.
And now for something completely different, even though we do it every single week. I've got your puppet regime. Hi, folks. Ian here with a simple question for you. Who screwed up worse in 2016, Mark Zuckerberg or Hillary Clinton?
Well, as the 2020 election approaches, we're releasing our biggest update yet.
Hi!
Yeah, it's a top-to-bottom reboot of the Hillary Clinton operating system.
Fidget spinners! Post Malone! Low-key, let's get some lean!
We've also upgraded Hillary's algorithm with a new pandering positional system, PPS. Look, she's in Texas.
Tacos!
Now she's in Idaho.
Low-key, this potato is everything.
Michigan, Wisconsin, yeah, remember those places?
I just checked in to the Rust Belt. Can anyone recommend a good #artisanal steel plant for lunch?
Or her home state of New York.
Hey, I'm walking here.
Hillary version 2.0.20 is gonna start rolling out just in time to maximally deflate enthusiasm.
Just like Facebook, I'll be here forever. Whether you like it or not, #blessed.
That's our show this week. We'll be back next week. Don't miss it. In the meantime, if you like what you've seen, and I know you do, I really know you do, check us out on GZEROmedia.com.